Make no mistake, Standard Oil was never just a company. It was a weapon forged from industrial-scale greed and targeted by a single man, John D. Rockefeller. Founded in 1870, the entity did not participate in the market. It was the market. It controlled more than 90% of all oil in the United States. It did not just beat out rivals, it consumed them in what became known as the Cleveland Massacre. It did not negotiate with railroads, it commanded them. This was absolute power built on secret deals and corporate espionage. The public, spurred on by journalist Ida Tarbell, cried out for blood. In 1911, the U.S. Supreme Court acted as executioner. Standard Oil was declared an illegal monopoly and ordered to be broken into 34 pieces. But you can't kill an idea. That death was a corporate illusion. It was a rebirth. This is the story of the sons of Standard Oil. The 34 heirs born from that execution? Today you know them by their names: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Amoco. They inherited their father's billions, political connections, and culture of disregard for the law. They fueled the 20th century, profited from wars, and then, as their own internal documents now prove, they made a calculated decision. In the 1970s, they discovered that their product was causing a disaster. This is the story of their 50-year war against the truth, a deliberately funded campaign of deception, trading the future of the planet for profit. The robber baron origins of a dynasty. The Standard Oil dynasty and the man who founded it, John D. Rockefeller, were not born from the East Coast old money of the Astors or the Vanderbilts. They were born from the gritty, chaotic, new money frontier of the American Midwest and forged in the fires of the Civil War. The patriarch of this new industrial family was not an aristocrat. He was the son of a con man. John D. Rockefeller's father, William Big Bill Rockefeller, was a notorious snake oil selling charlatan who abandoned his family, lived under false names, and practiced bigamy. This dark past, as chronicled in Ron Chernow's definitive biography, Titan, was the formative wound of John D.'s life. It instilled in him a rigid, almost fanatical Calvinist piety, a pathological hatred of chaos, and a single, overriding obsession: control. Rockefeller, born in 1839, began his career as a humble bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio. He was, by all accounts, a prodigy of numbers. He saved his money. And in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, he and his partners made their first great investment. They did not invest in the war. They invested in the black gold that had just been discovered in the fields of neighboring Pennsylvania: oil. The Pennsylvania oil rush was the gold rush of the East Coast. It was a chaotic, lawless boom and bust world of wildcat drillers, speculators, and profound waste. Rockefeller, the meticulous accountant, looked at this chaos and felt a physical revulsion. He saw the drillers as sinful gamblers, destined for ruin. He knew the real, stable, controllable money was not in finding the oil, but in refining it. In 1870, with $1 million in capital, he, his brother William, and a group of partners officially incorporated the Standard Oil Company in Cleveland, Ohio. The name was a statement of intent. They would be the standard, the only standard, in an industry of chaos. From this moment, Rockefeller began his campaign of conquest, a war to monopolize the entire American oil industry. His strategy was not to out-drill his competitors, but to strangle them, and his chosen weapon was transportation. Rockefeller understood a simple truth: any refiner who could not get his oil from the well to the market was dead. And in the 1870s, the only way to move oil was the railroad. Rockefeller, now the largest single shipper of oil in the world, approached the powerful railroad barons, like Cornelius Vanderbilt. He did not ask for a discount, he demanded a bribe. This was the infamous secret rebate system. The system was a work of criminal genius. Rockefeller would promise to give a railroad all of his business, a massive guaranteed contract. In exchange, the railroad would not only give him a 50% discount on his shipping rates, but they would also, secretly, pay him a drawback on every barrel his competitors shipped. This meant that for every barrel of oil a rival refiner shipped, a portion of that refiner's own shipping fee was being secretly funneled back into Rockefeller's pocket. He was not just getting his own oil to market for half the price. He was being paid by his enemies for the privilege of competing with him. This was the weapon he used to perpetrate the Cleveland Massacre of 1872. Armed with this unbeatable secret advantage, Rockefeller went to his 26 rival refiners in Cleveland. He approached them one by one, laid his books on the table, and made them an offer. He showed them the numbers. He proved with cold, hard logic that he could ship oil at a price they could not possibly match. They could, he explained, sell their worthless companies to him for a modest price, or he would drive them into bankruptcy within 6 months. The result was a rout. In a span of just 6 weeks, 22 of the 26 rival refiners in Cleveland panicked and sold out to Standard Oil. The massacre was a bloodless economic conquest. Rockefeller, in less than 2 months, had taken control of 25% of the entire U.S. refining industry. This was the dark past of the dynasty, the original sin. It was a monopoly built not on a better product, but on secret rebates, extortion, and industrial blackmail. Rockefeller replicated this model across the country. He moved into New York, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. He took on the powerful pipeline companies, waging a brutal war, dynamiting their lines, buying up their suppliers until they too sold out to him. In 1882, he formalized his control. He and his partners created the Standard Oil Trust. This was a new shadowy legal entity, the first great trust in American history. It was a holding company designed to hide the scale of their monopoly from the public and from government regulators. All the competing companies he had bought were transferred to a small board of trustees run by Rockefeller's inner circle. On paper, they looked like dozens of independent companies. In reality, they were all just one entity, Standard Oil. By 1890, the trust was complete. The Standard Oil dynasty controlled 90% of the American oil market. It was the largest, richest, and most feared corporation on earth. It was, in the words of one terrified politician, a government unto itself. But this absolute power had created a powerful new enemy, the American press. In 1902, the muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell began publishing a 19-part series in McClure's magazine titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. This was not just journalism, it was a vendetta. Tarbell's own father had been one of the small, independent Pennsylvania producers who had been driven to ruin by Rockefeller's predatory tactics. Her investigation, based on years of meticulous research, thousands of public documents, and interviews with executives who had been crushed by the trust, was a bombshell. For the first time, she exposed the entire secret criminal history to the public. The railroad rebates, the drawbacks, the corporate espionage, the price fixing, and the systematic massacre of his competitors. She did not just attack the company, she attacked the man. She contrasted Rockefeller's pious public image, the devout Baptist, the Sunday school teacher, with the ruthless, illegal, and immoral tactics he had used to build his empire. She painted him, in short, as a hypocrite. Tarbell's series was the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Gilded Age. It became a national sensation. It transformed John D. Rockefeller, the respected philanthropist, into Rockefeller, the symbol of predatory greed. The public outrage she fueled was so immense that it forced the U.S. government to act. President Theodore Roosevelt, who had been looking for a trust to bust, now had his ultimate target. Rockefeller, the patriarch of the dynasty, was now on the defensive. He responded to this existential threat in two ways. First, he launched the greatest philanthropic rebranding in history. He, the man who had built his fortune on secrecy, would now spend the second half of his life giving that fortune away publicly. This was an effort to erase his image. He had already, in 1890, founded the University of Chicago, pouring $80 million into creating a world-class institution from scratch. Now, he accelerated the process. In 1913, he established the Rockefeller Foundation, a global scientific and medical philanthropy with a $100 million endowment. This foundation would, in the 20th century, eradicate hookworm, fund the development of the yellow fever vaccine, and spark the green revolution in agriculture. It was an act of benevolence on a scale the world had never seen. But critics then and now argued this was not charity, it was reputation laundering. It was an attempt to use the tainted profits of his monopoly to wash the blood off the family name, transforming Rockefeller the robber baron into Rockefeller the saint. His second and more direct response to Tarbell's accusations was to fight the government in court. He and the dynasty would lose. The death and cloning of a dynasty. The Rockefeller dynasty by 1904 was under siege. Ida Tarbell's devastating expose in McClure's magazine had done more than just report on the Standard Oil Trust. It had convicted the family in the court of public opinion. She had given the American people a villain, a cold, calculating, and hypocritical patriarch, John D. Rockefeller, who had built a 90% monopoly on the back of secret rebates, railroad extortion, and the massacre of his competitors. The public, once awed by Rockefeller's wealth, was now furious. The robber baron era was ending, and the progressive era, a new age of reform, was dawning. The man who would ride this wave of public anger was President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, an aristocrat himself, was a savvy politician who understood the public's rage. He needed a dragon to slay, a trust to bust, to prove that the U.S. government was more powerful than the new private corporate dynasties that had seized control of the American economy. The Standard Oil Trust, thanks to Tarbell's work, was the biggest and most hated dragon of them all. In 1906, the Roosevelt administration, through its Department of Justice, launched its Holy War. The U.S. government filed a massive antitrust lawsuit against the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, the legal entity that held the trust. The charge was a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The lawsuit was a 170-page indictment, accusing the dynasty of being a single massive conspiracy and restraint of trade. This was not just a lawsuit. It was a clash of empires. It was the United States of America versus the Standard Oil dynasty. The legal battle that followed was the trial of the century, a grinding 5-year war of attrition. The government, armed with Tarbell's research and thousands of its own documents, laid out the case. Standard Oil was a predatory monopoly. Its lawyers detailed the secret rebates, the drawback system, the corporate espionage, and the systematic campaign to bankrupt or acquire 115 different competitors. The dynasty's defense, led by its team of high-priced lawyers, was a masterpiece of Gilded Age arrogance. Their argument was simple. So what? They argued that monopoly was just another word for efficiency. They claimed that Rockefeller had not destroyed the oil industry. He had saved it. He had taken a chaotic, dangerous, and wildly speculative business and transformed it into an orderly and stable one. Their key piece of evidence, the price of kerosene. Rockefeller's lawyers argued that his trust had, through its genius for organization, driven the price of kerosene down by 80%. He had made light cheap, safe, and available to every American home. He was not a robber baron, his lawyers argued. He was a public benefactor. This was the central question. Was Standard Oil an illegal, predatory conspiracy, or was it a good, efficient monopoly? The case wound its way through the courts, a legal battle of titans that lasted until 1909, when a federal circuit court finally ruled in the government's favor, ordering the trust to be dissolved. The dynasty, of course, appealed. The case now went to the Supreme Court of the United States. While the legal battle raged, John D. Rockefeller, the patriarch, was engaged in his own parallel war, a war for his legacy. He had already begun his massive philanthropic pivot, founding the University of Chicago and pouring millions into medical research. But as the trial wore on, he accelerated this reputation laundering campaign. In 1910, he finalized his grandest, most ambitious philanthropic project. He set aside $50 million to create the Rockefeller Foundation. This was not a local charity. It was a global scientific and medical corporation, a dynasty of benevolence. Its mission was to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. It would, in the coming decades, fund the eradication of hookworm, the development of the yellow fever vaccine, and the green revolution in agriculture. Rockefeller, the ultimate pragmatist, was building his second parallel empire. He knew that even if the government took his company, his name, now etched onto universities and medical foundations, would be immortal. He was washing his tainted money from the trust and turning it into clean money for humanity. On May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court delivered its final earth-shattering verdict. In the case of Standard Oil Company of New Jersey versus United States, the court, led by Chief Justice Edward Douglas White, ruled against the dynasty. The court found that the Standard Oil Trust was indeed an illegal monopoly in violation of the Sherman Act. It found that the dynasty had used unreasonable and predatory tactics, the rebates, the buyouts, the Cleveland Massacre, to restrain trade. The verdict was a total humiliating defeat for the Rockefeller dynasty. The court ordered the legal massacre that the government had demanded. The Standard Oil Trust was to be dissolved. It was to be shattered into 34 separate independent companies. The death sentence had been passed. The greatest, richest, and most powerful corporation the world had ever seen was to be executed. The Hydra was to be dismembered. The dynasty, it seemed, was dead. This was, as the New York Times trumpeted, the victory of the people. Ida Tarbell had won. Teddy Roosevelt had won. The robber baron era was over, except it wasn't. What happened next was the greatest financial irony in American history. The death of the dynasty was, in fact, the moment it became immortal and infinitely more powerful. The Supreme Court had ordered the trust to be dissolved, but it could not seize John D. Rockefeller's personal property, and his personal property was his stock. Rockefeller, as the patriarch, was the largest single shareholder of the Standard Oil Trust. When the trust was shattered into 34 pieces, he did not lose his wealth. He simply received his proportional controlling stake in all 34 of the new independent companies. Before 1911, his entire $300 million fortune was tied up in one company, which the government was actively trying to destroy. After 1911, he was now the largest private shareholder in 34 different companies, all of which were now legal, all of which were run by his hand-picked Standard Oil men, and all of which were now, for the first time, free to compete with each other. These were the baby standards, the heirs of the dynasty, and they were the most valuable set of children in history. The dragon had not been slain. Its head had been cut off, and 34 new, angrier, and now competing dragons had sprung up in its place. The most powerful of these pieces, which were now set free, would become the new giants of the 20th century. Standard Oil of New Jersey would eventually become Exxon. Standard Oil of New York would become Mobil. Standard Oil of California, known as SoCal, would become Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana would become Amoco. And other major pieces like Continental Oil Company and the Ohio Oil Company were now independent competing empires. The market immediately understood what had happened. These new companies, now unshackled from the trust, were free to explore, drill, and expand on their own. Their combined value exploded. John D. Rockefeller, the man who had just lost the greatest antitrust case in history, sat back and watched, in a single year, his personal fortune double. It soared from $300 million to nearly $900 million, the equivalent of over $400 billion today, adjusting for the size of the economy. The U.S. government, in its attempt to kill the monopoly, had made John D. Rockefeller the richest man in the history of the modern world. His public reaction was a masterpiece of PR spin. When reporters, expecting to find a broken man, asked him about the breakup, Rockefeller allegedly smiled with his cold reptilian calm and called it the best thing that ever happened to us. He was right. The Standard Oil dynasty was now decentralized. It was no longer a single vulnerable trust. It was a true family, a network of 34 powerful heirs that would, for the next century, dominate the global oil trade, becoming the seven sisters that controlled the world's energy supply. The 1911 breakup was not a fall. It was a cloning. It was the moment the dynasty ensured its own permanent global survival, setting the stage for the next 100 years of its power, its profits, and its dark legacy, a legacy that would, in the 1970s, lead its heirs to a new, secret discovery. The climate itself was at risk. The heirs conquer the world. The 1911 Supreme Court decision that shattered the Standard Oil Trust was, in the end, not an execution. It was a cloning. John D. Rockefeller, the patriarch, had been forced to dismember his hydra, but the 34 severed pieces were not dead. They were just free. This was the birth of the Standard Oil heirs, the second and far more powerful act of the Rockefeller dynasty. The U.S. government, in its attempt to break the American monopoly, had just unleashed a pack of 34 hungry, well-funded, and deeply interconnected children onto the global stage. The 20th century would not be defined by the fall of Standard Oil. It would be defined by the global conquest of its descendants. The baby standards that emerged from the breakup were not true competitors. They were a family in all but name. They were all run by Standard Oil men, executives who had been trained for decades in Rockefeller's ruthless, efficient, and secretive culture. For years, they honored spheres of influence, a gentleman's agreement that replicated the old monopoly on a regional scale. With the map of America carved up amongst themselves, the newly named titans, Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, turned their gaze outward. They had learned their father's lesson. A national monopoly was illegal and vulnerable. A global cartel, however, was just good business. John D. Rockefeller, the patriarch, now a semi-retired philanthropist, had become the richest man in human history by watching his children go to war. The first great act of these heirs was to escape America. They had learned their father's lesson. A national monopoly was illegal and vulnerable. A global cartel, however, was just good business. While Rockefeller had been focused on refining American oil, the heirs were now focused on finding and owning foreign oil. This was the new imperial age, and the baby standards were its private army. Exxon and Mobil, the two biggest brothers, led the charge. They plunged into the Dutch East Indies to fight Shell for its territory. They moved into Venezuela, but their greatest prize, the one that would define the next century, was the Middle East. In the 1920s and 1930s, the heirs of Rockefeller, in a series of backroom deals, joined forces with their European rivals, Royal Dutch Shell, and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. They formed a new secret trust, a global monopoly that made Rockefeller's original look small. This was the Seven Sisters cartel. These sisters, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Gulf, Texaco, Shell, and BP, were the new global government. They secretly colluded to fix the price of oil, carve up the world's resources, and control the political fate of entire nations. Chevron, in 1933, was the heir that struck the motherlode. It secured the first concession in Saudi Arabia. Exxon quickly forced its way into the deal. Together, the two baby standards, along with Mobil and Texaco, formed a new family-only consortium that would become the most valuable company on earth, Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Company. The Rockefeller dynasty, through its children, now controlled the largest and cheapest source of oil on the planet. This was the Golden Age, from the 1940s to the 1970s. The heirs were no longer just a dynasty, they were an oligarchy. They funded the Allied victory in World War II, fueled the post-war suburban boom in America, and rebuilt Europe with the Marshall Plan. Their business strategy was a perfection of their fathers. They maintained vertical integration. Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron owned everything. The wells in Saudi Arabia, the super tankers that crossed the ocean, the massive refineries in New Jersey and Texas, and the Esso, Mobil, and Chevron gas stations on every corner. They controlled the price from the wellhead to the pump, and they reaped a profit at every single step. And they perfected their father's darkest art, political influence. The line between the Standard Oil heirs and the U.S. State Department simply disappeared. The dynasty's executives like John J. McCloy became the wise men who ran American foreign policy. The goal of that policy was simple: protect the dynasty's access to cheap foreign oil at all costs. This soft power was not a conspiracy. It was a matter of public record. It was the 1953 CIA MI6 coup in Iran, which overthrew a democratic leader to protect BP and the Seven Sisters' interests. It was the lifelong intimate alliance with the House of Saud, a pact that guaranteed cheap oil in exchange for U.S. military protection. The heirs had successfully done what their father could not. They had merged their corporate interests with the national security interests of the United States. This golden age of absolute cartel-driven power lasted until 1973. The OPEC oil crisis was the first great tragedy to strike the new dynasty. The Arab nations, in response to U.S. support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, embargoed the West. They seized control of the oil fields. They nationalized Aramco. In a single stroke, the heirs had lost their crown jewels. Their business model, which relied on owning cheap Middle Eastern crude, was broken. This crisis, which brought the American economy to its knees, should have been the end of the dynasty. Instead, it was the beginning of its third and most profitable act. The heirs were now forced to find new, safe, non-OPEC oil. And this new oil was in the most hostile, dangerous, and expensive places on Earth: the deep, icy waters of the North Sea and the frozen tundra of Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. Only the baby standards, with their massive cartel-era profits and their unparalleled engineering expertise, had the billions in capital required to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline or to erect the massive concrete platforms in the North Sea. This crisis, in a brilliant, ironic twist, killed their competition. The smaller independent oil companies were wiped out, but the heirs, Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, who had the capital to make these multi-billion-dollar gambles, were reborn. They were now masters of high-tech, high-cost, high-risk drilling. And when the price of oil skyrocketed, their profits became obscene. This new, dangerous world of high-risk drilling led to the dynasty's first great dark legacy of the modern era, the Exxon Valdez. In March 1989, the Exxon Valdez, a massive supertanker carrying the dynasty's safe Alaskan crude, ran aground in Prince William Sound. The ship, which was being piloted by an overworked, understaffed crew, spilled 11 million gallons of thick, toxic crude oil into one of the most pristine ecosystems on Earth. It was the largest environmental disaster in U.S. history at that time. It was a Deepwater Horizon for its generation. The images of oil-soaked otters, dead birds, and blackened coastlines were a PR nightmare. The dynasty's response was a masterclass in corporate arrogance and legal warfare. Exxon, led by its famously abrasive CEO Lawrence Rawl, fought its victims in court for 2 decades. A $5 billion punitive damages verdict, awarded by an Alaskan jury to the 30,000 fishermen and residents whose lives had been destroyed, was fought by Exxon's lawyers all the way to the Supreme Court. In 2008, 19 years after the spill, the court, in Exxon Shipping Company versus Baker, agreed with the dynasty. It slashed the $5 billion fine down to just $507 million. It was a total legal victory for the dynasty. It sent a clear message to the world: it is cheaper to spill and then pay the lawyers than it is to invest in safety. While Exxon was fighting in the courts, the dynasty was quietly reassembling itself. The 1911 divorce was over. The 1980s and 90s were the era of the remarriage. The heirs had decided that in the new high-risk world of megaprojects, they needed to be super majors. The children began to marry their cousins. In 1984, Chevron bought Gulf Oil for $13.3 billion, the largest merger in history at the time. In 1998, Amoco was acquired by BP, and then in 1999, the final earth-shattering reunification occurred. Exxon, the largest heir, bought Mobil, the second largest heir, for $81 billion. This was the moment the Standard Oil Trust was reborn. The new company, ExxonMobil, was not just a company, it was a superstate. It was the largest, most profitable, and most powerful corporation on Earth, a single, vertically integrated entity that was more powerful than John D. Rockefeller's original trust had ever been. The 1911 Supreme Court decision was now effectively moot. The family was back together, and this new reunited dynasty, this second coming of Standard Oil, would immediately leverage its reconsolidated power. The dynasty's political strategy was now at its zenith. The revolving door was in full spin. Condoleezza Rice, a Stanford professor, had served on the board of directors of Chevron for a decade. In 2001, she became President George W. Bush's National Security Advisor. The heirs, particularly ExxonMobil and Chevron, were, according to investigative reports, among the most powerful lobbyists pushing for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Vice President Dick Cheney's Energy Task Force, which met in secret in 2001, had reportedly met with executives from Exxon, Chevron, and BP to plan the future of Iraq's nationalized oil fields. When the 2003 invasion, which was sold to the public on the premise of weapons of mass destruction, was complete, the spoils were divided, and the baby standards were the primary beneficiaries. ExxonMobil and Chevron, as part of the new consortiums, were granted massive, lucrative, no-bid contracts to redevelop the very Iraqi oil fields that had once been state-owned. The dynasty's profits exploded. In 2008, as the price of oil skyrocketed to $147 a barrel, ExxonMobil posted a profit of $45.2 billion. It was, at the time, the largest single-year profit for any corporation in human history. The dynasty, it seemed, had won. It had been killed by the U.S. government in 1911. It had reformed. It had conquered the globe. It had survived the OPEC crisis. It had survived the Exxon Valdez. And now it had profited massively from the Iraq War. But this dynasty, at the very peak of its absolute power, was harboring a secret. Locked within their own internal research labs was a discovery so devastating it made their monopolistic past look innocent by comparison. They had found a truth that threatened not just their business, but the entire world, and they decided to bury it. The dynasty's 50-year war on climate science. The Standard Oil dynasty, reunited as the supermajor ExxonMobil in 1999, had entered the 21st century at the apex of its power. It was the most profitable corporation in human history, its influence so vast it could lobby for wars and win. But this new consolidated family was harboring a secret, a dark past far more profound than its 19th century robber baron origins. This was not a secret of business, but of science. The dynasty, in its relentless pursuit of profit, had discovered the catastrophic consequences of its own product decades earlier, and, in a cold, calculated, multi-generational business decision, they had chosen to bury the truth and wage a 50-year war of deception and denial against the public, the government, and the entire planet. This is the story of the climate change cover-up, the dynasty's single greatest governance scandal, a crime that would overshadow even the Exxon Valdez and define the family's ultimate toxic legacy. The story begins not in the 2000s, but in the 1960s and 1970s. The heirs of Standard Oil, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, were not just oil men. They were scientists. They were the Bell Labs of the energy world, employing thousands of the world's best chemists, physicists, and engineers. As early as the 1960s, these internal scientists, along with the broader academic community, began to note a disturbing trend. The burning of fossil fuels was increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In 1977, the dark past of this scandal began. A senior scientist inside Exxon's own research division, James Black, gave a stark private presentation to the company's top executives. The title was The Greenhouse Effect. His findings, based on Exxon's own cutting-edge research, were not vague. They were horrifyingly precise. He warned his bosses that the burning of their core product was the most significant environmental issue for the coming decades. He presented models now proven to be incredibly accurate, predicting that CO2 levels would double by the mid-21st century, and that this would result in a catastrophic global temperature rise of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. He warned them in 1977 of the melting of the ice caps and the rising of the sea levels. The dynasty knew. They were, quite possibly, the best informed institution on Earth about the causes and consequences of climate change. The company's reaction was not denial. It was confirmation. Exxon did not fire James Black. Instead, they launched one of the most sophisticated, high-level scientific research programs of the 1970s and 80s. They spent millions of dollars. They equipped a supertanker, the SS Exxon Valdez, with state-of-the-art CO2 sensors to sample the oceans. They built their own climate models, and by 1982, their internal scientific consensus was unanimous. Their own research confirmed that the greenhouse effect was real, caused by their product, and would be catastrophic. An internal 1982 corporate primer, stamped not to be distributed externally, stated plainly that the consequences of their product would be well short of catastrophic only if the world took major society-wide steps to abandon fossil fuels. The dynasty was at a crossroads. It had in its hands the scientific proof that its core business model would, in time, render the planet uninhabitable. It had two choices. Option one, the Drexel path. Use their vast wealth and engineering genius to pivot, become the world's leader in the new energy technologies that they knew would be necessary. Option two, the Rockefeller path. Use their vast wealth and political power to protect the monopoly, deny the science, silence the scientists, and ensure that the world kept burning oil for as long as possible. The Standard Oil family chose option two. This was the Lung Phi Tai San Va Jung Jot Loi Ich on a planetary scale. It was a conscious, documented decision to wage a war on science for the sake of short-term profit. The operation, chronicled in the Pulitzer Prize finalist investigation by Inside Climate News in 2015, and later confirmed by researchers at Harvard University, was a masterpiece of dark PR that continued for 40 years. The dynasty's first act was to kill its own research. The scientists who had raised the alarm, like James Black, were reassigned. The multi-million-dollar climate research program was shut down. The internal models were buried. The second act was to build a machine of denial. Starting in the late 1980s and exploding in the 1990s, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and their partners launched a $30 million plus campaign of disinformation. They did not just stay silent. They funded a network of front groups and pseudo-scientific think tanks. These groups, with respectable-sounding names like the Global Climate Coalition and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, had one job: to manufacture uncertainty. They were to create a debate where, internally, the dynasty knew there was none. As a 1988 internal Mobil memo, revealed by Inside Climate News, made clear, the strategy was to emphasize the uncertainty in climate models, to confuse the public, and to target the media with alternative theories. The dynasty, led by Exxon, began to pay scientists for hire, men like Fred Seitz and Fred Singer, who had previously consulted for the tobacco industry to prove that smoking didn't cause cancer. These merchants of doubt, as historian Naomi Oreskes would later call them, were paid handsome fees to write op-eds, to testify before Congress, and to rebut the findings of the world's actual climate scientists. This was the crime. It was the exact same model that the tobacco industry had used to deny the link between smoking and cancer, and the dynasty, which had perfected the monopoly, was now perfecting the lie. While this disinformation campaign was raging in public, the dynasty was facing its own environmental disasters, which provided a perfect, deadly backdrop. The 1989 Exxon Valdez spill was the first great crack in the facade. The 11 million gallon spill was a PR nightmare that cost the company billions. And as the dynasty had already proven with the Valdez spill, where they'd spent 2 decades fighting in court to slash their punitive fines by 90%, the lesson Exxon took away was cynical, but simple. With enough lawyers, even the worst disaster becomes a line item, not a punishment. A second and far darker environmental scandal was brewing at the dynasty's other heir, Chevron. While Exxon was polluting Alaska, Chevron was facing allegations of deliberate, decades-long ecocide in the Ecuadorian Amazon. From 1964 to 1992, Texaco was the primary operator in the Lago Agrio oil fields. For 28 years, in a region inhabited by indigenous tribes, Texaco allegedly engaged in a systematic campaign of toxic dumping to save a few dollars per barrel. Instead of re-injecting the toxic production water back into the ground, Texaco allegedly dumped it all directly into the rivers, streams, and unlined pits of the Amazon rainforest. The result, as alleged by the 30,000 plaintiffs in a massive class action lawsuit, was a rainforest Chernobyl. An estimated 18 billion gallons of toxic formation water were dumped. The contamination, according to the Ecuadorian courts, led to an epidemic of cancer, miscarriages, and birth defects among the local tribes who relied on the rivers for their drinking and bathing water. In 2011, an Ecuadorian court, after a long and bitter trial, found Chevron guilty. They ordered the Standard Oil heir to pay $9.5 billion in damages. Chevron's response was a pure, cold echo of John D. Rockefeller himself. They did not pay. They did not negotiate. They declared war on the entire country of Ecuador. Chevron's general counsel was recorded in a video stating the company's legal strategy. We're going to fight this until hell freezes over, and then we'll fight it out on the ice. The dynasty fled the jurisdiction. They moved all their assets out of Ecuador. They then used their massive legal team to countersue the victims' own lawyers in U.S. court, accusing them of fraud and racketeering. As of 2024, Chevron has not paid a single cent of the $9.5 billion judgment. The dynasty had proven, once again, that it was more powerful than the law and more powerful than entire nations. This was the backdrop, a dynasty that was actively denying climate science in public while simultaneously refusing to pay for its actual environmental disasters in Alaska and Ecuador. And then, in the 2000s, the dynasty, now reunited as ExxonMobil and Chevron, cashed in on its greatest political investment, the Iraq War. As detailed in the previous chapter, the 2003 invasion, which had been lobbied for by the dynasty's alumni in the Bush administration, was a profit bonanza. ExxonMobil and Chevron were the primary beneficiaries of the no-bid contracts to redevelop Iraq's oil fields. The profits were staggering. In 2008, as the price of oil skyrocketed, ExxonMobil posted a profit of $45.2 billion. It was, at the time, the largest single-year profit for any corporation in human history. This was the dynasty at its absolute peak, militarily, politically, and financially triumphant. They were richer than their founder, more powerful than the government that had tried to break them, and they had successfully, for 30 years, hidden the dark secret about their own product. The 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster, which involved their sister company BP, was just another confirmation of their worldview. It was a $65 billion tragedy, but for Exxon and Chevron, it was a competitive advantage. While BP was forced to divest and sell off its assets to pay the fines, they were there to buy them. This entire period from the 1970s to the 2010s was the dynasty's golden age of denial. But in 2015, the dark past they had buried in 1977 finally exploded. The investigative journalists at Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times, in a Pulitzer finalist series, published Exxon's own secret internal documents from the 1970s and 80s. The memos from James Black, the 1982 not to be distributed externally primer, the climate models that were startlingly accurate, it was all laid bare. The world could now see in black and white that the Exxon dynasty knew. They had known about climate change in precise detail before most of the public had even heard the term global warming, and they had chosen to lie. The reports proved with the dynasty's own documents that at the exact same time their scientists were privately warning of catastrophic sea level rise, their lobbyists were publicly funding the Global Climate Coalition to deny it. They were paying merchants of doubt to mock the very science their own PhDs had confirmed. This was the ultimate governance scandal. It was not just an abuse, it was a systemic 40-year-long, multi-billion-dollar conspiracy to defraud the public, a conspiracy that had cost the human race its last best chance to avert the climate crisis. The legal and public backlash was and is ongoing. Attorneys general across the country, from New York to California, launched fraud investigations into ExxonMobil. The state of California, in 2023, filed a massive lawsuit against Exxon, Chevron, and the other heirs, accusing them of a decades-long campaign of deception that had caused tens of billions of dollars in climate-related damages. The heirs of Standard Oil, just like their father in 1911, were once again on trial for their lives. But this time, the crime was not monopoly. It was, as the plaintiffs alleged, the climate catastrophe itself, a dynasty's legacy at war with itself. The 2015 Inside Climate News investigation was the final fatal blow to the Rockefeller dynasty. It was the Ida Tarbell of the 21st century, but its accusation was infinitely greater. Tarbell, in 1904, had accused John D. Rockefeller of being a corporate criminal who had illegally monopolized an industry. The 2015 investigation, using the dynasty's own internal memos, accused his heirs at ExxonMobil of being planetary criminals, a corporate family that had, for 50 years, knowingly and deliberately pushed the world toward a catastrophic climate disaster, all to protect their monopoly. This was the original sin of Standard Oil, magnified to a global existential scale. The Cleveland Massacre of 1872 was a conspiracy to kill competitors. This was a conspiracy to kill the truth. The fallout from this revelation and the wave of state-level lawsuits that followed triggered the final personal tragedy and disintegration of the Rockefeller name. It was not a disintegration of the company. The heirs, ExxonMobil and Chevron, were by this point trillion-dollar superstates, richer and more powerful than their founder had ever been. No, the disintegration was moral. It was a civil war that split the Rockefeller dynasty in two, pitting the corporate heirs against the bloodline heirs. It was a battle for the soul of the Rockefeller name. On one side of this war was the corporate dynasty, the baby Standards. Their response to the 2015 revelations was a perfect cynical echo of John D. Rockefeller's response to Ida Tarbell 110 years earlier: deny, deflect, and deploy overwhelming force. ExxonMobil's leadership, led by CEOs like Rex Tillerson, did not apologize. They attacked. They called the Inside Climate News reports inaccurate and deliberately misleading. They funded their own studies, continued to lobby Congress, and spent hundreds of millions on a new greenwashing PR campaign, touting their investment in low-carbon solutions. This was the conspiracy in its modern form. It was no longer a secret plot. It was a public campaign of disinformation. This was the real soft power of the Standard Oil dynasty. It was the $31 million that Exxon alone had spent as documented by Greenpeace between 1998 and 2017, funding a vast network of merchants of doubt, think tanks, front groups, and pseudoscientists, whose only job was to manufacture uncertainty about the climate crisis. They were, in effect, running their father's predatory pricing playbook, but on the marketplace of ideas, flooding the zone with junk science to drive the truth into bankruptcy. They wielded this power in Washington, spending tens of millions of dollars every year on lobbying, as tracked by open secrets, to kill or weaken every single piece of meaningful climate legislation. They were, as the 2023 UN IPCC report would conclude, the central figures in a climate catastrophe. This was the dark legacy of the corporate heirs. They were, in the end, true to their founder, ruthless, efficient, and completely indifferent to the collateral damage of their monopoly. But on the other side of this war was the bloodline dynasty. This was the other family, the descendants of John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son who had been raised in the shadow of the 1911 breakup. Jr. had been haunted by his father's robber baron reputation. He had spent his entire life trying to atone for it, to wash the tainted money. He was the one who built Rockefeller Center, who donated the land for the United Nations, and who poured his inheritance into the Rockefeller Foundation. His children, in turn, David, Nelson, Lawrence, and Winthrop, had become the American aristocracy, a family of governors, bankers, and philanthropists. They were the respectable Rockefellers. And in the 2010s, this respectable family, the ones who ran the Rockefeller Family Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation, were forced to confront the dark criminal legacy of their other family, ExxonMobil. The 2015 Inside Climate News report was, for them, a moment of profound familial shame. They had been lied to just as the public had. They had believed the green washing. Now they saw in black and white that the company their great-grandfather had founded was engaged in a morally reprehensible campaign of deception. And, in a move that was the final true disintegration of the Rockefeller dynasty, they chose a side. The bloodline publicly and formally declared war on the corporation. In 2016, the Rockefeller Family Fund, led by the family's younger generation, announced that it was divesting its entire portfolio from fossil fuels. And, in a stunning targeted act of betrayal, they announced they were divesting with all deliberate speed from ExxonMobil. Their public statement was a stab to the heart of the dynasty. They accused ExxonMobil of morally reprehensible conduct, of being guilty of a 50-year-long campaign of deception. They were, in effect, agreeing with the lawsuits from California and New York. They were testifying against their own heir. The Rockefeller Foundation, the massive $25 billion philanthropic giant that John D. Sr. had created, soon followed. In 2020, they too announced they would divest their entire endowment from fossil fuels. This was the ultimate personal tragedy of the Rockefeller legacy. It was the final, ironic fulfillment of the original sin. The dynasty's story had begun with William Big Bill Rockefeller, the con man who had abandoned his family. His son, John D. Rockefeller, was the obsessive, joyless accountant who had spent his life trying to control the world, to build an orderly empire that would erase the chaos of his father. His corporate heirs had inherited his ruthless, predatory, monopolistic side. His bloodline heirs had inherited his pious, philanthropic, reputation laundering side. For a century, these two halves of the dynasty, the dark and the light, had coexisted. The foundation had spent its billions fixing the world's problems, while the corporation had spent its billions creating a new one. Now the bloodline had finally been forced to confront the corporation, and in doing so, they had divorced their own name. The Rockefeller Foundation, the entity that existed only because of Standard Oil's profits, was now leading the global divest-invest movement, a campaign dedicated to the financial destruction of ExxonMobil, Chevron, and the entire fossil fuel industry. This is the final baffling and tragic disintegration. The Standard Oil dynasty is now at war with the Rockefeller dynasty, but the tragic verdict as of 2024 is that the corporate heirs are winning. ExxonMobil and Chevron are richer, more profitable, and more powerful than ever. The $500 billion in combined market capitalization of the baby standards is vastly larger than the $10 billion of the bloodline family's remaining fortune. The conspiracy of denial that the dynasty had perfected was a stunning success. It had worked. It had successfully delayed meaningful global action on climate change for 40 years, long enough for the heirs to lock in their profits and their infrastructure, ensuring the world would remain addicted to their product for decades more. The legal attacks so far have failed. The 2019 New York vs. ExxonMobil climate fraud case, which the bloodline family had supported, collapsed in court. The judge, while acknowledging Exxon's lies, ruled that they did not technically constitute financial fraud. The dynasty of the heirs had once again proven that, like its founder, it could be morally bankrupt but legally bulletproof. The final verdict on the Standard Oil dynasty is a dark one. John D. Rockefeller, the man, died in 1937. His reputation washed clean by his philanthropy. But the corporate children he spawned in the 1911 breakup, the baby standards, are still alive. And these heirs had inherited their father's worst traits: his monopolistic greed, his culture of secrecy, and his total ruthless indifference to the collateral damage of his business. The dynasty that Ida Tarbell had tried to kill in 1911 had survived. It had just cloned itself, and it had spent the next century perpetrating a Cleveland massacre, not just on a few rival refiners, but on the entire global climate.